Last week, we talked about two different points in the same sermon that didn't necessarily feel very connected. And so today, I want to try my best to try and connect those for us. If you missed the sermon last week, that's okay. You might be able to follow along. You can also catch the sermon on our Facebook page and YouTube page if you want to hear more. I would really strongly encourage it, especially for that first point. But as a reminder for all of us, the 2 points. The first one was intended to help us to be more intentional about learning and understanding the context of language used in the New Testament when something like the Jews is mentioned, or in our reading today, fear of the Jews. And again, this can feel unsettling to us in today's context and culture, which isn't a bad thing. But rather than skipping over these or dismissing them, it's important for us to learn about this internal struggle back in that time period amongst different Jewish traditions, and one of which ultimately became what we adhere to today, a different religion altogether, Christianity. It also means we should consider changing our language when we can and where we can, while also working to denounce and condemn any anti-Semitism, but especially any anti-Jewish theology or teaching that comes from within our Christian tradition or circles. So again, if you'd like to unpack this a little bit more, you can head back and watch our other last week's sermon to get a little bit more on that. The other seemingly disconnected point in last week's sermon was reframing our understanding of doubt and faith, not as opposites, but as part of a generative cycle that leads to actions of faithfulness. This means that the opposite of faith is actually inaction or complacency. If last week we refocused doubt as neither wrong nor weak, then today I want to try to do the same with the notion of fear. My hope is that it will indeed tie together last week's 2 points with something helpful for us moving forward in our own journeys of faith and journey together. In short, faith and doubt work together to compel us to action. Fear and complacency conspire to maintain equilibrium, our status quo. Before doubt enters the story with the faith of Thomas, which we discussed last week, the beginning of the story, the setting has the disciples huddling in fear. The text literally says, in fear of the Jews. And again, this was a reference written by the author of the gospel, who was almost certainly Jewish himself as well. This author was a proponent of a different, growing offshoot of Judaism that Jesus' followers were leading, which was resulting in an understandably heated internal disagreement around the Jewish faith. As we said last week, and we'll try to say it as often as we need to whenever these moments come up in our sacred scriptures, comments like this fear of the Jews comment in today's reading were not meant to mark an entire people group as responsible for violence or as the recipients of violence. The authors and the disciples were also Jewish themselves, so that would have been to their own harm and detriment too. With this in mind, we can understand, though, how prescient the message of Jesus was to them. In that moment, in context of upheaval and disagreement, he says to the disciples, "Peace be with you." In the midst of palpable fear of the unknown, threats of violence, the disciples are huddled and static. They aren't doing anything but hiding. In one sense, their fear has led them to become complacent and inactive, and it's into this moment and posture of fear that Jesus enters the room and their consciousness, giving them the authority and power to reframe their fears. Instead of feeling helpless to the powers that be, Jesus was giving them the power of the Spirit that had raised him from the dead. What could they possibly be afraid of any longer? Over the centuries, people have misunderstood the point of this and other similar stories, as if it grants broad permission to hate, harm, or discriminate against an entire people group through anti-Semitic remarks and violence. Maybe instead, an all too real message from this story is that we can often misidentify our fears by projecting them onto other people or other people groups, as history has borne out in this example. Instead of recognizing our fear of the unknown, of uncertain danger, of lost jobs, of lost traditions, of lost decency, of lost causes, we foist our unprocessed and unnamed anxieties onto people or political parties or nations and cause harm to them in order to protect ourselves. Even still, too often, we label fear as a bad thing, when really it's a human and evolutionary response. The challenge then isn't not to be afraid, it's sometimes we can't help when our adrenaline is triggered. The challenge and calling both for Christians is not to let our fears lead us astray. Whether in harmful projections onto entire groups of people or categories of individuals, whether an easy denial of reality and facts, or blissful ignorance, or indifference to the plight of others for fear of what it could mean for or require of us. We must not let fear conspire to make us complacent in our way of faith. Jesus ends this passage saying that if you retain the sins of any, they are retained. At the end of his moment with the disciples, before he appears to Thomas, he says to the disciples that if they retain the sins of any, they are retained. In other words, when we mischaracterize entire people groups or beliefs, we are being dishonest. And by holding on to our misinformed impressions or refusing to wrestle with new information and experiences and facts, we are holding on to much more than our own prejudices, fears, and complacency. We are retaining our own sin. If last week was focused on our faith as it pertains to God, I wonder today if we might consider our faith as it pertains to people. In light of the past year, I wonder if we ask ourselves, do we really want to believe the masses of people clamoring for their experiences and scars to be believed? Or Do we only believe what we see and touch and experience ourselves, our own lived experiences, and not someone else's that we cannot relate to? Are we indifferent to the needs or concerns of others when it requires something of us, some kind of change perhaps, that ultimately leads us to conscious or unconscious complacency? Maybe the only action we take is rigidity. Why? Why are we so afraid to hear someone else? Why are we so afraid to change our minds? Why are we so quick to villainize entire groups of people? What are we so afraid of? Is it change? Leadership scholar Ronald Heifetz posits that people aren't afraid of change. They're afraid of loss. He goes on to use the example that no one's afraid of the change that comes from winning the lottery. But changing a worship service, preaching a different direction, changing a long-held tradition or a partisan belief, that risks us losing something. That's the central call and challenge of the gospel of Jesus, too. Are you willing to reframe what winning and losing really is? What gaining and giving looks like, what being and following a different way will cost? What are you so afraid of? What are you afraid of losing? I can't spell out all those answers for you personally. But as your pastor, I really think each of you, all of us, needs to spend time examining that. And I'd also say you need to pay attention to these next few moments. Because if you profess a faith in Jesus, in this Jesus we worship today, this religion we call Christianity, then it fundamentally requires more of you than something akin to a membership at the symphony. It fundamentally demands more of you than checking a box on a form when someone's asking your religious affiliation. It fundamentally obligates you to more than simply continuing a family heritage. You can see those as losses, or you can see and hear the story anew. It's tantalizing intrigue about something we cannot fully comprehend or even grasp with our own two hands. Faith will necessarily encounter doubts, questions, discomfort, uncertainties, even loss. But two, it will generate curiosity, humility, imagination, listening, learning, growing, changing, actions that are aligned with a life-giving faith. It's not unlike exercising a physical body. You have to engage resistance if you want to keep healthy and grow stronger. And it's the same with faith. And for some of us, maybe many of us, doubts and questions will feel a lot like fear. I think that's probably the reality. It's scary not to know some things, especially significant things, especially when there's a risk of loss and or change. But what you do with those doubts and fears is the key to a different way of living than the dominant culture and world millennia over have prescribed. Instead of huddling, projecting, dismissing, hoarding, competing, denying, or denigrating, we as Christians and followers of this way of Jesus lean into the uncomfortable unknowns, risking exposure and vulnerabilities, our fears and the unfamiliar, in order to understand more about this world, about each other, about God, about ourselves. We listen and we learn and we grow in our faith. And that leads us to live differently in our world, to seek changes in our societies, politics or not. And it compels us to repeat the cycle again and again and again, this life of faith that's a process of learning and growing and acting and questioning and challenging our fears and learning and growing and acting and questioning and challenging our fears, all of it faith. Converting into faithfulness. Doubt is not wrong or weaker. Fear is inevitable. And they both derive from the same place, the unknown. But if the resurrection shows us anything, it's that the unknown is rife with possibilities. Fear of loss might linger somewhere there, but the unknown is where hope of new life and new ideas and new possibilities and new dreams and new communities abide. Into that room, into the lives of those disciples who were huddled in fear of the known and unknown, fearing the loss of their very lives. The risen Christ appeared, offering peace and promising his Spirit to accompany them on the journey ahead, out of complacency and into faithfulness and new life. Into your room, into your lives of fear and doubts and anger and trauma, the risen Christ is appearing, offering peace and his Spirit to accompany you on the journey ahead, out of complacency and into faithfulness and a new life. So friends, be brave in exorcising your fears, and be bold in entertaining your doubts, because in so doing, you will be exorcising the very heart of your faith.